Hey everyone, I'm back with another Genshin Impact video. But first off, I want to thank all my subscribers because we just hit 100 subscribers. Now, that might not seem like a big number, but it is to me, so thank you all so much for supporting me in my futile attempt to do math. Also, I am but a poor college student, so it's possible that the next few videos will be delayed as a result. This video was already incredibly hard to make with all the calculations and subsequent script I had to make, so this video is already late. You might also want to skip around this video because it's going to be a pretty long video. There's a lot I had to go through, so you might want to do that. But on to the video. Today's topic is another DPS comparison video, also known as, is Zoob going to make more people mad over fictional characters' power levels? This time I'm looking at the only real bow DPS character, Ganyu. Well, I mean, I'll also be comparing her with the other DPS characters who have bows, but are clearly inferior to Coco Goat. They are Tartaglia, Fischl, and Amber. To be totally honest though, this video was initially just comparing Ganyu and Tartaglia, but then I felt it wasn't fair to the other bow DPS characters if I ignored them, especially the sheer amount of Amber mains that actually exist, and I wasn't going to make a video just on Amber and Fischl, so they got slapped into this video as well. Now, of course, there are some pretty glaring differences between these characters. Other than the fact that they all use bows, not only are their elements all different, but so are their entire playstyles. Ganyu and Amber are charge shot focused DPS units, while Tartaglia is more of a burst style DPS where he's only on the field for about 15 seconds, then he's off again because otherwise he has to resort to his much weaker ranged attack. And Fischl is just a normal attack focused DPS where you spam the normal attack. However, that's pretty much enough for me to work off of. After all still primarily deal damage as their main role, or something like that. I don't really know, I need content. Now, unlike my last few videos, this one is going back to the Assumptions and Notes page. First, as with my other DPS comparison videos, all characters are going to be level 70, Ascension 4, Constellation 0. For those who didn't watch those other videos, this is the most easily accessible tier of power where you gain access to each character's passive too. Second, all talents are level 6. There are still people in this game who have played since the beginning and have not received a specific talent ascension material from any of the weekly bosses. And several characters also share the same boss materials, so it's possible that someone might have spent it already on a different character. Third, all characters will be using their burst off cooldown. Sort of. This will be explained in each character's analysis later because energy recharge is incredibly annoying to factor in, and there's also a lot of team stuff that goes into energy. Fourth, I'm doing something a bit different from my other videos because, my god, people love to complain. Instead of arbitrarily assuming that there is only one enemy, I decided to analyze the characters in 4 different combat scenarios. The first scenario is a cluster of 5 enemies in a trapezoid directly in front of the character. This is incredibly useful for AoE characters like Claymore users and some Catalyst users, like Klee. The second scenario is a single lone enemy. Nothing special, just the old way I used to calculate, but sometimes you do end up just fighting one enemy, like in Tartaglia's domain or certain Abyss floors. The third scenario is a single large enemy, like a boss, Ruin Guard, or Lava Churl. This is different from the lone enemy scenario because the larger hitbox means that some multi-hit attacks will hit this entity more often, like with Albedo's Burst or Ganyu's Burst. The fourth and final scenario is against flanking enemies, which are just 2 enemies, one at the front and the other directly behind. Again, this is separate from the lone scenario because some attacks are capable of hitting enemies all around the character, like Tartaglia's Burst or Ganyu's Burst. Actually, most bursts hit in a large enough AoE that it hits all enemies directly next to the character, but not all. I want to make this important distinction, however. Every character's DPS is likely to fluctuate between these various formations, sometimes within the span of a single combat. One moment you'd be fighting the cluster, then you'd be fighting a lone enemy, but then an enemy would get behind you and you'd be flanked. It's all incredibly random, so don't look at the DPS values for each formation and say, yeah, my Tartaglia can do 3000 damage all the time, when in reality, it's only when 5 enemies are tightly packed together. Also, the DPS values for the cluster are all damages dealt to all enemies. It's additive, so if I deal 5 DPS to each enemy, the DPS value will be 25 and not just 5. Finally, DPS will be calculated as damage per second. I'm ditching the alt damage percent per second that I used to do because of how varied things get between weapons when they have attack percent as their substep, as well as the sheer differences in characters' base attack values. Also, I have learned that some of my previous calculations may be wrong. I haven't checked through the other videos, but apparently the damage bonus percent is additive to all other bonuses that say damage bonus percent. So things like the Wanderer's Troop 4-piece, Solar Pearl, and Elemental damage bonuses all add together, then multiply by the attack stat of your character, which I've now accounted for in this video. There are still a couple of assumptions that I had to make, but they're character specific, so I'll talk about them when I get to that point. Now let's get started with the math. First, we're going to be looking at the 11th Harbinger, Tartaglia, who doesn't actually use the bow. Like I said earlier, Tartaglia is a burst-style DPS, but only because of how his skill works. For those who don't know, Tartaglia's skill, Foul Legacy Raging Tide, allows him to swap between ranged and melee attacks. However, his melee attacks deal hydro damage unconditionally and deal slightly more damage than his ranged attacks, so you want to stay in melee form for as long as possible. The only problem is that the longer you stay in melee form, the longer the cooldown becomes. Since Tartaglia doesn't really use his ranged normal attacks, here are the values for his melee normal attacks. As you can see, the values aren't necessarily that high, especially at talent level 6. And that's because the damage from this talent is primarily the Riptide slash damage. See, the fun thing with Tartaglia is that his passive 2, Sword of Torrents, causes every critical hit of his melee to apply the status effect Riptide. When any enemy affected by Riptide is hit by Tartaglia's melee attack or charged range shot, that effect will detonate, dealing AoE hydro damage in the form of Riptide slash damage. This means that every time you crit while in melee form, the next attack will deal an extra 88% damage to everything directly next to the target. Do you see where this is going? If you have a group of enemies all tightly packed together and detonate the Riptide on them, they will all take the 88% damage from the initial hit and all the other detonations. The total damage dealt grows exponentially with each added enemy. With only one enemy, Tartaglia's Riptide Slash will only add an additional 88% damage. But with 2 enemies, that damage increases to 176% damage, which is a total of 352% damage dealt across all enemies instead of just 88%. And this increases, again exponentially, with each added enemy. This effect also counts as a normal attack for things like bonus normal damage percent on the Heart of Depth set 4-piece. Now you might be thinking to yourself, that's it, right? There's no way this can get any stronger, right? Well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong, because Tartaglia has the only combat passive 3 in the entire game. Mastery of Weaponry increases all party members' normal attack talent level by 1, and this applies to Tartaglia's skill, because his skill effectively changes from ranged normal attacks to melee normal attacks, and that means they still count as normal attacks. This in turn means that Tartaglia's normal attacks will be at talent level 7 instead of 6 without any additional boss talent ascension materials. Thus, a single rotation of Tartaglia's melee normal attack will deal 517.2% damage plus an additional 95% damage multiplied by the number of enemies squared, all of which is dealt over approximately 200 frames. However, Riptide can only be detonated once per 1.5 seconds, but I'll explain why this isn't too problematic real soon. Tartaglia's burst, Havoc Obliteration, deals nice AoE hydro damage regardless of his stance. In range stance, he does AoE hydro damage at a distance. In melee stance, he does AoE hydro damage, but at melee range. Now, if you notice on his damage table, Tartaglia doesn't seem to do that much damage. It's decent, but it's nothing earth-shattering. Or is it? There's another aspect of Tartaglia's burst called Riptide Blast, which tacks on an additional damage, and it works exactly the same way that Riptide Slash works. If you hit an enemy that's affected by Riptide with Tartaglia's melee burst, they will detonate, taking and dealing an additional 168% damage to surrounding enemies. Again though, it also increases the damage exponentially with each enemy. With the 1.5 second cooldown of Riptide detonations, Riptide Blast, which is separate from Riptide Slash, will hit every enemy, and with a standard crit rate of 50%, most, if not all enemies, will detonate with the Riptide Burst. So the total damage dealt by this attack is 650% plus 168% times the number of enemies squared when using the melee burst over about 135 frames, which is also honestly the only version you should ever use if you want to maximize damage. Tartaglia's ranged version doesn't do as much damage, does not detonate Riptide, but it does give you back energy. So if you need the energy, you can use his ranged, and if you have C6, use his ranged. Now before we get to the damage calculations, we need to look at Tartaglia's stats. At level 70, Tartaglia has 231 attack and 14.4% hydro damage bonus. I'm going to ignore weapons for the time being because the best bows are gacha, and it's not guaranteed that everyone has them or that many people have them. As a result, he has the base 5% crit rate and 50% crit damage. So, let's take the damage values and plug them into our formations. Against the cluster, Tartaglia's normal attacks will hit at least 2 of them. Maybe even 3, but that's going to be difficult to maintain since Tartaglia moves forward when he attacks, even if we assume these enemies don't get knocked around like the pinballs they are. However, one of Tartaglia's attacks is a sweep, which does hit all 5. Now, I can't calculate just that part of the attack to hit all 5, but this does allow for Riptide to hit all enemies. Tartaglia's burst will hit all of them, no questions asked. The AoE is huge, he will hit all enemies. So to calculate this damage, first we need to take Tartaglia's burst cooldown, subtract the frames it needs, and divide the remainder by the frames needed for the normal attack. His burst has a cooldown of 15, so that's equivalent to 900 frames. We subtract the approximate 135 frames that his burst takes, then divide it by the approximately 200 frames that his total normal attack rotation takes to get 3.825 total rotations. However, in order to account for error from variables like dodging or mistiming, I will be adding 23 frames, which is the amount of frames a dodge uses, for every 300 frames, just in case you need to dodge. So basically every 5 seconds, I'm assuming you need to dodge once. Then I will round this value to the nearest 0.5 because you don't actually need to dodge every 300 frames. Sometimes you can just dash, run a bit, and then just kind of stop, and then you'll be fine fighting. Or in like Tartaglia's case, you can just keep fighting and just tank through everything while killing everything around you. In any case, with the extra 23 frames per 300 frames, the amount of rotations you can get through is about 3.5. With each full rotation of Tartaglia's normal attack, he will also proc approximately 2 Riptides, so the damage dealt by his normal attack is 3.5 times 517.2% times 2 plus 7 times 95% times 5 squared multiplied by Tartaglia's attack stat, crit stat, and damage bonuses. The same goes for his burst damage, except his burst will hit 5 enemies instead of 2. Adding them up and multiplying it out gives us a total DPS of 5001.25. I mean, at least against the cluster formation. See, against Formation 2, the lone enemy, or Formation 3, the boss, Tartaglia's total damage drops significantly. If we take our original function, all we have to do is change that 5 into a 1, and we get the new value of 594.69 damage per second, approximately 12% of the damage against the cluster formation due to the exponential growth that the cluster formation gets from Tartaglia's Riptide Burst and Riptide Slash. The final formation, the flank formation, has a slightly modified formula for Tartaglia. Since there's an enemy behind Tartaglia, he won't be able to hit it with his normal attacks, but his burst will still reach him, just not the Riptide Blast because he won't be able to apply Riptide to him. Due to this, Tartaglia will only do 712.06 damage per second. And that's pretty much it for the hard Tartaglia math, so here's the spreadsheet I used for him. On the spreadsheet, you should notice that I've included a couple different weapons on it, so it's not just his base attack, otherwise that'd be a pretty sad spreadsheet. I have the 5-star weapons, I have the Battle Pass weapon, and the 2 craftable bows. Honestly, I could have included more weapons, but that would have taken more time than I cared to put into this spreadsheet, and that would have also made this video much longer than it already is. Now, if you want to, you can just make a copy of this sheet, the link is in the description below, and then plug in the values of the weapons that you want to use. All the terms here, all of it should be pretty self-explanatory. You just have Tartaglia's base attack, his additional stat, and then damage bonus percents effectively. And then below that you have the multiplier values for his attacks, and then below that are the straight damages he does based on the multiplier values and his attack and other stats. And finally at the bottom you have the lone enemy attack DPS. Not on this sheet is actually the cluster lone boss flank formation specifically. They're all there, it's just not on this sheet that I show you because I already talked about them in the video. But it's there, so if you change any of the values, you can see how it changes against each formation. I also want to point out that for this sheet, if you look closely, you'll notice that Ammo's bow is best in slot for Tartaglia. But that's not actually entirely true, because this sheet does not have the artifact stats put into it. You can, if you want to, there is a spot that I have on the sheets where you can apply your own artifact stats, but right now, there are no artifact stats put into it at all. So if you put in, say, a plus 20 attack timepiece, Skyward Harp does outdamage Ammo's bow, and that's because Ammo's bow requires you to use charge attacks primarily, and you need to be pretty far away from enemies in order to get that additional charge attack damage. Other than that, there isn't much to talk about for this sheet in particular, so I'm going to move on to the assumptions and notes that I made for Tartaglia specifically. First off, Tartaglia will never be able to use his burst off cooldown, like ever, because his skill only generates 1 energy per target hit, and this is when you press the skill button, he does a small hydro explosion around him, and for every enemy hit, he gets 1 energy. Even if you have a lot of energy recharge, the problem here is that you can hit maybe 3 enemies with it. If you're hitting any more, you're going to get stun locked, and his burst requires 60 energy. Now there are 2 other Hydra characters in the game that can generate energy, and they're Xingqiu and Mona. The problem here is that Xingqiu's skill is on a 21-second cooldown and only generates 5 particles, or 15 energy, while Mona's a 5-star non-rate-up character who only generates 3 particles every 12 seconds, or 9 energy per 12 seconds. If you're running Xingqiu and Tartaglia, you'd still need 200% energy recharge. With Mona, you'd still need 230% energy recharge. Neither are really that feasible. Even if you add in the other 2 units of a team, it's highly likely you're not going to have 100% off cooldown burst usage. The second assumption is Tartaglia only uses his skill for 15 seconds at a time. This is because the longer Tartaglia is in his melee stance, the longer the cooldown on the skill, right? But this does mean that for the other 15 seconds, you can fill in with the supports on your team. It's the very optimal strategy. Any longer on Tartaglia means you have to spend more time as your support, so you don't want to do that. So I assume you keep it to 15 seconds at a time. The third assumption, I did ignore Tartaglia's Riptide Burst, which occurs whenever an enemy dies while affected by Riptide. This is impossible to calculate for, and honestly, most enemies are probably going to die from Riptide Slash anyways, so I don't think it happens often unless Riptide Slash applies Riptide Burst. Assumption 4 is whenever Tartaglia uses his skill, there is an initial damage occurrence. Like I said, when he uses his skill, he does a Hydro Burst around him. That does do 101% damage, but this happens once per 30 seconds, and it's extremely short range, so most people are not going to use this offensively, and any damage from it will most likely be accidental. Essentially, thus, Tartaglia has extremely high DPS only if you can get multiple enemies stuck together. The more enemies stuck together, the higher the damage he would do by a significant amount. And that should be it, right? Wrong. There's one more aspect I still need to talk about. Artifacts. Artifacts are finicky things. On one hand, the value of the substats is completely random, so it's impossible to say that any DPS value is a true average. On the other hand, set bonuses are standard, so to not include them would be to ignore a large part of many characters' damage. Not to mention, there are often different builds that can be considered the best for each character, depending on the weapon and team comps you have on hand. After all, not everyone has every character at C6 to freely build teams with. The best example is actually Ganyu. If you're building a freeze comp, you'd want Blizzard Shredder for the extra crit, but if you're doing a melt comp, you want Wanderer's Troop for the much higher at-will charge attacks that have melt. Now, Tartaglia doesn't really have this issue, but since Ganyu does, that means I'd have to craft optimal team comps for every single unit that I'm discussing here, or else it's not fair to every other unit here. And that would lead me to discussing about 10 different characters, their bursts, skills, cooldowns, and frame data, and that's honestly way too much work for one video. While I also understand that characters don't really fight in a total vacuum, I don't want these videos to be that long. This one's already an hour long. Those kinds of in-depth looks into each character's build would be better suited to their own video if you want that. Therefore, I hope no one complains that I will not be going over artifacts in this video. So without further ado, let's continue with the rest of the video. The next character I want to talk about is Fischl. To be completely honest, I don't actually have her frame data. My computer isn't actually strong enough to record Genshin with OBS and allow me to count the frames. It just stutters a lot when I try. I get 5 frames per 30 seconds on the recording for some reason. There also isn't a lot of videos of Fischl doing her normal attacks, so I had to time it myself in Genshin, which does inevitably lead to error because I can't tell the exact point her normal attacks stop because I can't press jump and the start-stop on my timer. I also slightly ignored the animation time on her skill and burst. Her skill isn't as big of an issue because you can actually fit that pretty much between her normal attack rotations and lose maybe 3 frames, I think? I don't know, but it's not that big. Her burst, however, takes around 2 seconds to unleash, based upon the time it takes to use the burst, swap to a different character to cut it short, then swap back to Fischl. It's a rough estimate, but it's not entirely inaccurate either. But it's also not the most accurate measurement, so it's a very, very rough estimate. Luckily though, it's not that important since the way I build the talent rotation allows for some leeway. I also want to point out that Fischl without Constellations is actually incredibly mediocre as a main DPS. But onwards with the math and with the speed. Fischl's normal attack, Bolts of Downfall, has these values at talent level 6. Totaled up, Fischl's normal attack rotation deals 405.5% damage. Using my timings, I measured her normal attack to take roughly around 2.75 seconds, and that's actually it for her normal attacks. It's nothing complicated like with Tartaglia. Fischl's skill, Night Rider, is where she normally shines. And by Fischl, I mean Oz. Over 10 seconds, Oz will shoot 9 times, dealing 124% damage each shot, and will also deal 162% damage upon summoning. The only problem with Oz is that he's only on the field for 10 seconds, after which he will vanish for 15 seconds, unless you use Fischl's Burst, Midnight Phantasmagoria. Now this talent causes Fischl to transform into Oz momentarily and deal electro damage to any opponent she touches. This damage is pretty much negligible, because its only real use is resummoning Oz. At level 6, the damage dealt is 291%. For a burst that requires 60 energy, this isn't actually all that bad per se, but it's negligible because in order to actually deal the damage, you have to be practically on top of an enemy. Now this would be all fine if Fischl gained invincibility frames when she's Oz, but she doesn't, so it's incredibly risky to even attempt to use her burst offensively, because if an enemy is hitting you while you're Oz, they will hit you and it will still do damage, and it can cause hit stun, I think. I'm not entirely sure about that. But you don't get iframes. Now that said, you can still use it as a damage tool, you just have to know that there is a very, very real risk of dying while doing this. And as I've discussed earlier, Fischl's Burst takes about 2 seconds to use, mostly because you have to swap to another character to save time, otherwise you're stuck as Oz for I think 3 seconds. Now that we have all the attack values, let's work out the timings and stats. If you add up the total uptime for Oz, we find that Oz only has a total uptime of 20 seconds if we include the burst with a total cooldown of 25 seconds, as based on alternating the skill and burst to maximize Oz uptime. Within these 25 seconds, we have to remove the rough 2 seconds needed for the burst, as well as the 23 frames per 300 frames. We then divide this by the 2.75 rough time, or 165 frames, taken by the normal attack rotation, to get roughly 7.5 total attack rotations. This means that Oz will shoot 18 times total during this 25 second interval as well. Now, Fischl has 189 base attack at level 70, as well as an additional 12% attack bonus from Ascension stat. This gives her a total base attack of 211.68. So we just take the damage with the normal attack and multiply it by 7.5. The skill damage is equivalent to 18 times 124% since Oz is shooting 18 times, plus 162% times the number of enemies in the AoE. The burst is just 291% times the number of enemies in the AoE, though to be fair, this is an overestimation because you will only rarely use this offensively. Then we multiply each value by Fischl's attack, crit stats, and other damage bonuses, and then we add everything up to get 11,449.61 plus 351.49 times S plus 631.39 times B. The S represents the number of enemies in the skill AoE, and the B represents the number of enemies in the burst AoE. Now we get to plug in our formations into our formula. Against the cluster formation, both the skill and burst will hit all 5 enemies in a best case scenario. Plugging these values in gives us a total damage of 16,364.01, which we must then divide by 25 seconds to get us 654.24 damage per second. Against the lone and boss formations, the skill and burst can only hit that one enemy, so Fischl will be dealing a total of 12,424.36 damage over 25 seconds for 496.97 damage per second. Finally, against the flank formation, Fischl's skill will only hit one of them, while her burst may hit both. I'm kind of unsure honestly, but Oz's turns are pretty tight, so you could hit both pretty easily if you wanted to. This puts Fischl's total damage at 13,055.75 and a damage per second of 522.23. Alright, that's it for Fischl, so have another break. Here's the Fischl spreadsheet if you want to see the math that I did. Also a reminder that all sheets are available to peruse in the link in the description. Now for some Fischl assumptions I had to make. Like I discussed before I started, none of the timings I did are completely accurate. I think they're good enough for this, but they're not 100% accurate. I don't have the exact frame data for this, so keep in mind that all of this can be more or less depending on what the actual frame data says. Also, Fischl only generates 12 electroparticles in that 25-second span by herself, so she needs at least 67% extra energy recharge in order to be self-sufficient, as well as having her burst up at the beginning of the combat. This isn't too difficult, but if you need to balance her energy recharge stat with crit stats, it can get a bit more hectic, but you can get up to like 50% extra energy recharge just on accident. You could also opt to use an electro support for both the resonance and to act as a minor battery or sub DPS. You don't need to, but it can help, and if you have a really strong electro sub DPS like Beidou, go for it. That's it for the assumptions, so I need to go over some caveats. So the problem with Fischl is that she doesn't do that much damage from her normal attacks. If you take a look at the damage provided by her normal versus Oz, Oz is doing about 97.95% of the damage of her normal attack. So alone, Oz is making up almost half the entire damage that Fischl's entire kit does. So while you could build physical Fischl, it's actually far more beneficial to build her for electro damage and use her as a sub DPS. If you're determined to make her a main DPS though, that's when you'd run a superconduct team. The multiplicative 40% physical resistance strat will increase Fischl's damage by far more than any other electro reaction, since electro reactions suck in general. Also, given the fact that physical damage goblets and bloodstained chivalry all have much higher scalings, this makes physical Fischl a more viable build. Another aspect that needs to be considered, however, are Fischl's Constellations. Her C1 causes Oz to deal 22% attack as physical damage every time Fischl does a normal attack. Her C2 increases Oz's summoning damage, C4 causes her burst to do extra electro damage, and her C6, and arguably best constellation, adds an additional 30% attack as electro damage for every normal attack done, regardless of whether or not Fischl's on field. Add on top of this Fischl's passive 2, which deals additional damage whenever their active character causes an electro-related reaction. The vast majority of Fischl's kit is geared towards her being a sub-DPS who can enable very high electro damage when off-field. As a side note, I'd also like to point out that if you use Fischl as main DPS, her passive 2 will rarely proc due to how it has to be the active character causing the reaction. If you're using, say, Xingqiu's Burst, and you're constantly auto-attacking with Fischl, those swords he summons don't count. You will not get it unless Oz then shoots onto the Hydro. Then it would count. So it's kind of weird, depends on who you use. But if you only have C1, physical Fischl works pretty damn well. I actually ran the math for Fischl when using the compound bow, 2-piece bloodstained chivalry, max physical gauntlet, max timepiece, and a permanent superconduct, versus Fischl with prototype crescent, 2-piece thundering fury, max electro goblet, and a max timepiece. And under these constants, physical Fischl actually outdamages electro Fischl until you get to C6, where her electro build then vastly outperforms her physical build, because having that additional 30% attack as electro damage every time you attack is incredible. But that's also incredible on everyone else, especially other units who attack really fast. If you have a polearm user as a main DPS somewhere, C6 Fischl works far better with that unit than it does for Fischl, because it scales based off auto attacks. So, other than that, there's nothing much else to Fischl, so let's move on. Up next is Amber, commonly referred to as a lighter. To be completely honest, she's weak. Not necessarily because her kit is bad, like the actual mechanics behind them are bad, but rather because her scalings are incredibly low. But let's take a look at her talents so you can see it too. Amber's normal attack Sharpshooter is the typical archer talent. At talent level 6, Amber deals 174% damage per charge shot. While this in itself is fine, especially since it takes about 120 frames for Amber's charge shot, the problems arise when we look further into Amber's kit. Amber's skill, Explosive Puppet, is Amber's weakest part of her kit. At talent level 6, it deals 172% damage while having 57.9% of her HP. Dealing only 172% of her attack is incredibly low, but the worst part about this kit, at least in my opinion, is the fact that this puppet can be moved very easily by enemies. For example, if a charging shield Minotaur targets the puppet, as they would normally do due to it taunting enemies, they will push the puppet to the literal far corners of the world, where it will deal its paltry damage to one enemy, and then it's no longer taunting enemies because it's too far away. So, this skill is almost completely useless. Unless you're doing one of the monolith stages, in which case it's okay, but it deals super low damage, and it can be moved. Now, from my measurements, it only takes about 48 frames for this skill to be used, so it's not too bad in terms of frame usage, but again, its damage is pitiful. Moving on, we have Amber's Burst, Fiery Rain. This attack is actually incredibly useful, with one caveat. Dealing 708% damage over 2 seconds is decent. However, since the damage is dealt in 18 separate waves, she can't make use of any elemental reaction in a meaningful fashion. It takes about 150 frames for this talent to be used, which is pretty long honestly, and it can be incredibly frustrating when you use her burst, but don't gain enough invincibility frames. But this is kind of offset by the extremely low energy cost and short cooldown. While Amber's skill produces 4 particles, this isn't quite enough to be self-sustaining, but if you swap at all, she'll almost always have enough energy to use her burst. Now, given the cooldowns of Amber's abilities, I use the 60-second standard here to avoid any unnecessary fractions or decimals. With 60 seconds, or 3,600 frames, Amber can use her burst 5 times and skill 4 times. With the burst taking 150 frames and her skill taking 48 frames, plus the 23 frames per 300 for error and dodging, we end up with 26.467 charge shots done over a period of 60 seconds, or just 26.5 charge shots. At level 70, Amber has 172 base attack with 12% on her Ascension stat. But we do need to factor in passives. Unlike Tartaglia or Fischl, Amber's passives are just straight stat buffs as opposed to mechanic changes. Her passive 1, Precise Shot, increases her attack by 15% if she hits a weak spot. Now, most enemies do have a weak spot. Every hilichurl and humanoid's weak spot is their head. Actually, most enemies' weak spot is their head. Now, the more elemental creatures don't have weak spots, like the slimes or hypostasis cubes, they aren't exactly rare, but the amount of enemies that have weak spots do outweigh those that don't, so I decided to give Amber as much help as possible and input that extra 15% attack for all her attacks constantly. I mean, it's not really that hard to hit one weak spot per 10 seconds anyways. So this puts Amber's total attack at a minimum of 218.44. So now it's time for Amber's formula. Her normal attacks will hit 26.5 times, her skill will be used 4 times, and her burst will be used 5 times. With a total attack of 218.44, we can just multiply this by crit stats and other additional bonuses, right? Not quite, because Amber's passive 2 is a bit unique in that it adds crit rate directly to one talent. The specifics of this passive are that Amber's burst, Fiery Rain, simply has 10% extra crit rate and a 30% larger AoE. Again, just straight stat increases, but at least they're useful. Therefore, our formula now looks like this, and when simplified, results in the formula 10,324.08 plus 1,540.44 times the skill AoE enemies plus 8,312.73 times the burst AoE enemies. If you didn't get all that, it's okay, because I'm just going to use it to derive the end result anyways. Now we take the formations and plug in our newly derived formula. Against the cluster formation, Amber will hit all 5 of her skill and burst. This results in a total of 59,589.94 damage over 60 seconds for 993.17 damage per second. Against the lone and boss formations, Amber will only hit the one enemy, resulting in 20,177.25 damage for 336.29 damage per second. Against the flank formation, interesting things happen, and that interesting thing is Amber's skill, which will drag both enemies to one area, so both her skill and burst will hit both enemies for a total of 30,030.42 damage and 500.51 damage per second. And that's it for Amber. You can take a look at all these numbers, but I'm moving on. So we're back to another breakpoint. Are you tired yet? Do you need a drink? Maybe do some stretches? In any case, here is our spreadsheet if you're interested. If you're not, you still get to see it. Also, though I gave Amber that extra 15% attack from her passive 1, I did not account for actually hitting weak spots on her charge shots, since this isn't applicable to all enemies. Other than the cubes and maybe Oceanid, there are no fights in the game against strong enemies without weak points, thus it's reasonable to assume that Amber can have her passive 1 up constantly since it lasts for 10 seconds. However, the same cannot be said of each individual enemy, and I also can't assume that you will always hit weak spots. You just have to hit a weak spot once every seconds to maintain the buff, but I did not put in 100% crit rate for the charge shots because, again, not everyone has a weak spot, and not everyone is going to be able to hit those weak spots all the time anyways. Now, with the actual sheet itself, as you can see, the problem lies with Amber's skill. While most other skills do good damage and immediately apply their element, Amber's skill deals terrible damage and only applies the element when it explodes, which could take up to 8 seconds to do so. Even her artifact sets are kinda weird. There are 2 main artifact sets I'd run in Amber, a 2-piece Crimson Witch and 2-piece Gladiator's Finale, or a 4-piece Wanderer's Troop. The 2-2 Crimson Gladiator set increases all of Amber's damage, while the 4-piece Wanderer's Troop increases only Amber's charge attack, given her reliance on charge attacks. Personally, I would run the 2-2 Crimson Gladiator set because it increases all damage, and Amber's highest damaging attack is her burst, unless you're running a weak shot comp that's designed to make her charge shot deal 100,000 damage. The problem with these 2 artifact sets, though, is that due to Amber's fundamentally low attack stat, while both sets would increase her damage, it's not going to be very significant. There are people who have shown Amber one-shotting enemies with either a powerful charge shot or a manual pepper detonation, but those require a bit of setup and extremely heavy investment into Amber. So, like every other character in the game, Amber is viable as a DPS build, but you're likely to see higher returns for the same investment into a different character. But let's talk about Amber's Constellations real quickly. Now, fair warning, most of these are okay at best. None of them really make Amber all that much better. They're useful, but not necessarily game-changing for her. Amber's first constellation causes each aimed shot to shoot twice, with the second arrow only doing 20% of the first shot. Now, this isn't entirely useless, but it's only realistically useful if you're building a Melt Wanderer's Troop charge shot focused DPS build. Otherwise, a 20% attack on only charge shot is kind of useless. Her second constellation is a necessary component for several one-shot Amber videos. When you shoot Amber's puppet, Baron Bunny, it will explode automatically and deal an additional 200% damage. This actually makes Amber's skill deal decent damage, but the setup required is incredibly annoying. You have to shoot specifically at the foot of Baron Bunny with a fully charged shot. If you shoot the head, or the arms, or the body of the puppet, nothing will happen. You have to shoot the foot. So if you're aiming upwards on a hill and your bunny is up there, you're not likely to get that manual detonation. Also, again, Bear and Bunny can be moved, so you can shoot, and then the bunny would get moved because someone just pushed it. Amber's 4th constellation decreases her skill's cooldown by 20%, bringing it down to 12 seconds, but also adds an additional charge. Not game-breaking, but this one's actually pretty useful. You can now drop 2 bunnies at the beginning and gain up to, I think, like 8 energy particles. So pretty good, but that's only at the beginning. The decreased cooldown is nice. Since the puppet does last for 8 seconds, you now have only like a 4-second downtime at any given point. And Amber's 6th constellation increases her party's movement speed by 15% and attack by 15% for 10 seconds whenever she uses her burst. This constellation makes Amber a better swap unit, but is otherwise unnoticeable, especially when compared to Bennett, who can boost your party's attack by at least 300 at C0. So even if you do get constellations on Amber, she doesn't get that much better. Again, you can build her for this, but there's not much reason to do this besides you really liking Amber as a character. Finally, it's time to do some Coco Goat math. Ganyu's normal attack, Liuetian Archery, is a normal 6-shot attack with decent scalings, but the real damage comes from the charge shots. Instead of only having 1 level of charge, Ganyu has 2. This 2nd level charge attack deals increased damage, but also explodes upon impact, dealing AoE crowd damage at almost 2 times the initial shot damage. At talent level 6, the level 2 charge shot deals a total of 484% damage. According to the values derived by Jinx and Tuner, it takes about 137 frames on average to charge and shoot a level 2 charge shot. However, it must also be noted that if you practice with Ganyu, you can get the frame count lower because you can actually shoot a level 2 charge shot before it finishes charging. Now, I don't have the hardware specs to measure the exact values, but it can be significant. Of course, it's also possible to mistime your shots and instead gain frames instead of lose, so 137 is a rough average. Now, Ganyu's skill, Trail the Chilin, is a taunt similar to Amber's, but Ganyu's is stationary, deals damage upon creation and when it explodes. Given that it does taunt enemies, it's almost guaranteed that if you hit with the first half, it will hit with the second. Thus, the damage it will do at talent level 6 is 185% times 2 for a total of 370% damage, as well as 4 cryo particles. It takes approximately 30 frames for the skill to be used, and those 30 frames are mostly spent on Ganyu dodging backwards, which makes this a nice escape skill as well. Granted, she will target the enemy closest to her, and if that enemy is charging at her, she might dodge in a straight line, all Prometheus style like, but it's still quick movement for no stamina, plus a taunt. Finally, we have Ganyu's burst, Celestial Shower. While it's similar in appearance to Amber's burst, it's actually fundamentally different. Whereas Amber's burst hits in waves, each of Ganyu's icicles is its own projectile that deals its own damage. At talent level 6, each of Ganyu's icicles will deal 98% damage. The targeting system of this burst is relatively simple too. If there is an enemy in the circle, it will be targeted and hit with an icicle about once every 5 icicles. If there are 2 or more enemies, each enemy will be hit by a different icicle in the rotation. Effectively, if you have 5 enemies within the AoE, each enemy will be hit once by an icicle in a 5 icicle rotation. But the important part of this burst is that each icicle deals AoE damage as well. So if all 5 enemies are clumped together, all of them will take the 98% damage per icicle, and since it runs on a 5 icicle cycle, that damage adds up quickly. For any given enemy in the AoE, about 10 icicles will hit them, so the typical enemy will take at least 980% damage. But it also exponentially increases if all of them are combined, so it's 980% for each enemy, but if all the enemies are clumped together, it's actually 5 times that times 5. This burst also takes up approximately 122 frames on a cooldown of 15 seconds, so keep that in mind for when we get into the formula. Given the cooldowns on Ganyu's burst and skill, a 30-second standard will be used, allowing for 3 skill uses and 2 burst uses. 30 seconds is equivalent to 1800 frames, and subtracting the frame count and the dodge count gives us 9.693 total charge shots. Rounding down to the nearest 0.5 gives us about 9.5 charge shots per 1800 frames. Ganyu also boasts a whopping 256 base attack at level 70, as well as 19.2% crit damage. With all those stats out of the way, it's time to get to the formula. Ganyu's charge attack first deals single target damage, then AoE damage from the bloom, which is the only real discrepancy between Ganyu and the other characters. Her skill is pretty standard, it deals AoE damage so it hits all enemies in range, but her burst is unique in that it hits all enemies in the AoE with each icicle, but each icicle has its own damage value, which is also AoE. So with 2 enemies right next to each other, Ganyu's total damage from that one icicle quadruples, just like Tartaglia. Now, even if the icicle impacts the ground nearby an enemy, they will still take that damage. So to simplify this, I'm just going to square the number of enemies since it's exponential. I'm just going to do that. It's hard to calculate the damage from icicles hitting the ground, so this is just what I'm going to go with. Ganyu's attack and crit formula is pretty normal with her additional crit damage from her Ascension stat. But there's more. Ganyu's passive 1, Undivided Heart, increases the crit rate of her normal attacks after the first arrow is shot. If you're using Ganyu as your main DPS, you will always have this buff up. 5 seconds is an incredibly long time, especially if it only takes 137 frames to charge up, so you have over 2.5 seconds to shoot again. Not only that, Ganyu's passive 2, Harmony Between Heaven and Earth, grants a 20% cryo damage bonus to all members within its AoE. If you have at least 62% energy recharge on Ganyu, and have Kaya or Diona in the team, you will always have your burst active, if you consistently use them to get energy. And since Ganyu is a bow user, she can comfortably stand in the AoE for a burst and still shoot enemies. Given her two passives, we can now alter her formula accordingly. The new formula now looks like this. Simplified, the formula comes down to 6,127.68 plus C times 10,441.01 plus S times 3,527.9 plus B squared times 6,229.45. Now we're going to plug this formula into the formations. Against the cluster formation, Ganyu's charge attack will hit one of the enemies with the first shot, and the bloom will hit all the other enemies, including the original one. Her burst and skill will just hit every enemy, and keeping these AoEs in mind, Ganyu will deal a total of 231,708.53 damage, and dividing this by 30 seconds gives us a total of 7,723.62 damage per second. Against the lone formation, all variables go down to 1, and we get a total of 26,326.04 damage dealt, and a DPS of 877.53. Keep in mind that this is the value you should be looking at to determine how much damage you're doing to a specific target if you're not in a cluster, or if the enemies aren't packly tight enough for a cluster. Now, unlike every other character, Ganyu has a slight difference when she faces the boss formation. Due to the size of these so-called boss enemies, Ganyu's burst is actually capable of hitting them at least twice with every icicle cycle, just due to random chance. It's possible for this value to be higher, but I found that 2 icicles per cycle was the bare minimum. Due to this, the burst damage against the boss formation is double. Everything else is exactly the same as the lone formation and results in 32,555.5 damage and a DPS of 1,085.18. For the flank formation, there's another slight distinction between Ganyu and the others. Just like Amber, her taunt would bring both enemies to one area. The issue here, and with Amber honestly, is that the taunt explodes and knocks back enemies slightly. Due to this, the enemies won't be grouped close enough for the exponential damage from the burst. They will be close enough for Ganyu's charge shots, though, resulting in 46,524.41 damage dealt and 1,550.81 damage per second. And that's it for Ganyu. Here's another break, and here's the spreadsheet. If you can't tell, or if you didn't notice, she is far, far stronger than literally everybody else on this list. She's the ideal archer as of patch 1.2, with her only weakness being her squishiness, but you can mitigate this with a decent shield unit like Diona, who also gives you crowd resonance. And not only that, Diona also works for shields, heals, and energy particles. Like, she's perfect for Ganyu. Like, if you have Diona and you have Ganyu, use them together, unless you're not running the freeze comp. If you're running a melt comp, don't use Diona as much. You probably would want to use something like Zhongli if you have it. Now for some Ganyu assumptions. First, I did not account for hitting weak spots on her charge shots, just like Amber. Not every enemy has a weak spot, and even if you play the game a lot, it can be difficult to hit headshots on several enemies, especially if they're moving. However, Ganyu also just has a really high crit rate just based on her artifacts and resonance, so she gets it a lot. Second, I assume she just sits in her burst AoE. That's not always possible, but I don't know how often anyone will be able to be in the AoE and for how long. Like, you can just sit in the AoE for the entire duration of it, and because it's a 15-second cooldown on her burst, but also a 15-second duration, with enough energy recharge, you can have it permanently up, so you're always going to have that crowd bonus. And if any enemies comes towards you, you can just use her skill, taunt them, and they're going to get hit by icicles now. So, it's possible, yes, that she won't be in her burst AoE the whole time, but at the same time, it is also entirely possible you can just sit in there, and it's not actually difficult to just sit in there. The third assumption is, I did say that each enemy in Ganyu's burst will be hit 10 times each, but if you're fighting more than 5 enemies, things get kind of sketchy because now the icicles will cycle between all enemies, but it won't generate more than the already allotted icicles. It will only generate that, like, 50-ish icicles, and it's also timed to frame rate and lag, apparently. If you have a higher frame rate, you can hit actually 51 icicles, but if you have a lower frame rate, you actually have, I think it's like 47 icicles. So it's possible you actually get less damage dealt because of your ping. At the same time, though, if you're only fighting 4 or less enemies, it's possible for most enemies to actually get hit by an additional icicle through sheer chance. So, if you're fighting anything less than 5 icicles, it throws everything off. If you're fighting more than 5 enemies, it throws everything off. So, the cluster damage and load, actually all the damage values are kind of iffy if you look at just the burst. But that pretty much covers all the big assumptions I had to make. For artifacts, you should really only be building 4-piece Blizzard Traders for the additional crit rate. However, if you really want to, you could build the 4-piece Wanderer's Troop and play a reverse melt comp. The only problem with this build is that it does require you to use Shilling in order to continuously proc Pyro on enemies, because no one else has this off-field Pyro application. Nobody. But if you build this comp, you also lose out on a lot of crit rate and crit damage, so you're going to have to build that with your artifacts, which may make it harder to build for, because we have the freeze comp. You only need attack percent and crit damage percent. That's literally it, because you're going to get so much crit rate from the from the crowd resonance, and the artifact set. You're just going to get, I think it's like 55% up to 75% if you have them frozen of just crit rate. You don't need to build any crit rate. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter all that much because she just does so much damage with no artifacts. But yeah, so now it's time for the conclusion. Welcome everyone. If you're here from the timestamps, or you scrolled till you got here, or you just watched this whole video, welcome to the conclusion. I highly suggest you familiarize yourself with the assumptions and notes page if you haven't already. I'd also appreciate it if you watched the whole video, but I know that not everyone cares that much about the math. So let's get started. Of our 4 bow DPS characters, we have our 4 different enemy formations: the cluster, lone, boss, and flank formations. If you want the math to how I derived any of these values, you can find them in each character's respective analysis, or my spreadsheets in the description below. Keep in mind that these values are not maximum DPS values, but actually average minimum DPS against that particular formation. If you fight this formation for a moment, you can be expected to do roughly the shown DPS values, but you are also unlikely to fight any of these formations for very long, so also expect your DPS to fluctuate between the given values. Also, if you're wearing any weapon on these characters, they're going to do more DPS than here, alright? Because none of these values were derived with a weapon included. So let's go through each character against each formation. Tartaglia will deal 2,479.44 cluster DPS, 594.69 lone and boss DPS, and 712.06 flank DPS. Fischl will deal 654.24 cluster DPS, 496.97 lone and boss DPS, and 522.53 flank DPS. Amber will deal 993.17 cluster DPS, 336.29 lone and boss DPS, and 500.51 flank DPS. Ganyu will deal 7,723.62 cluster DPS, 877.53 lone DPS, 1,085.18 boss DPS, and 1,550.81 flank DPS. If you can't tell, Ganyu deals the absolute highest damage regardless of formation. That's sort of to be expected, of course, as she does get that 5-star scaling on her base stats. But what is surprising is that she outdamages Tartaglia, who is regarded as one of the best DPS units against groups. So what gives? Well, first off, obviously artifacts play a massive role in DPS, which I didn't account for, mostly because that would cause me to have to research optimal team comps, actually theorize best team comps, and then cause this video to drag on even longer. But even if we do that, it wouldn't increase the damage in Tartaglia's favor. If we give him his best set, the Heart of Depth set, it increases his hydro damage by 15% and also increases his normal and charged attacks by 30% every time he uses his elemental skill. Now that's great because his Riptide is considered a normal attack. But if we give him his artifact set, we have to do the same for Ganyu, and even if we go with the technically weaker set of 4-piece Blizzard Strayer, Ganyu gains 40% crit rate, which increases all of her damage by higher margins than a normal and charged attack damage boost. Granted, this requires you to be playing a freeze comp, which can be hard to pull off without the right units. But then again, you can sidestep running a freeze comp and just slap an additional cryo unit into Ganyu's team and gain a flat extra 15% crit rate because all her attacks deal and cause cryo application. Tartaglia, unfortunately, does not have that resonance bonus that every other unit gets as well. Hydro Resonance is the worst resonance in the game because there are very few stages where you need that much healing. Typically, you're either healing chip damage off and a single Barbara heal is enough, or your character just got one shot. There are also other factors at work here though, like how closely enemies are clumped together. The cluster formation implies that 5 characters are all right next to each other, right in front of the character. That's not typically the case, and where Tartaglia's Riptide can reach, Ganyu's Icicles might not. So before people start saying I didn't account for slightly more spread out enemies, Ganyu's cluster DPS against the less ideal cluster is 3,570.65. And this is the absolute minimum damage that Ganyu will do against the cluster formation, because her icicles can still randomly hit other enemies, and if the enemies walk by each other and an icicle falls, it will hit them both. So 3,570.65 DPS is the absolute minimum damage. Tartaglia's minimum DPS, though, is 1,992.78. Against the less than ideal cluster, though, I'd say the range of what constitutes an ideal cluster is larger for Tartaglia than for Ganyu. Like, it's easier for Tartaglia to get an ideal cluster because the AoE on his Riptide, Slash, and Blast are very, very large. I think so anyways. Similarly though, Amber, who appears to have more AoE damage than Fischl, is only because I made her skill and burst hit all enemies in the cluster formation. Given that Baron Bunny does explode and knock back enemies, Amber's burst can miss several of them, and even her charge shots can miss. If you're aiming at an enemy and you shoot, and just when you shoot, Baron Bunny explodes, you just missed. So her damage can decrease. But Amber needs some love, so I'm going to give it to her. I'll just let her have that, because she loses to Fischl in every other field. Finally, if anyone wanted to know how much damage they're dealing to each member of a cluster, a rough estimate would be to just divide the cluster damage by 5. If you do this, you should notice that Ganyu and Tartaglia are a bit off from their lone damage. This is because of their exponential damages in their kits, so as the number of enemies increases from 1 to 5, the higher the DPS becomes to each individual enemy. Also, Tartaglia and actually all of them, when they use their normal attack or charge shot, that's typically a single target thing, so you're not actually going to be doing exactly cluster damage divided by 5 for each individual. It's probably going to be more shifted towards, I'd say it's probably about 23% to one enemy, and then everyone else gets about 19% damage, give or take. For Amber and Fischl, I hope you can see that neither of them are really exceptional DPS units. Honestly, I don't think they're even good main DPS units. You can make it work, but I would not. Like I said with Amber, the amount of investment you'd be putting into either unit is not going to pay off as hard as you investing into a unit with actually decent stats and talent scalings. Even if Amber or Fischl had the base attack stat that Ganyu or Tartaglia have, they still suffer a lot because of their low talent scalings. To be fair to Fischl though, if she had the base attack of Ganyu, her lone DPS actually beats Tartaglia's, but once there's more than one enemy, he outdamages Fischl again because Tartaglia sucks at doing lone damage. Now I'm going to go on to some minor factors that can influence damage. First, Ganyu can't hurt enemies with physical shields. The Minotaurs and Hilichurls with shields are actually invincible against Ganyu. They're also pretty much invincible against most other units except the Pyro and Claymore units for the Dendro and Geo shields respectively, so this is sort of a non-issue, but Ganyu specifically, if she uses her charge shot against one of these shielded enemies, they will just block it. Even if they're facing away from her, they will block the entire shot. I don't know if this is a bug or if this is a feature, but these wooden shield boys will not take damage from Ganyu's charge shots, or the resulting bloom. In regards to elemental shields, given that they're all bow users with easy access to elements, means that they can all break shields with relative ease. Like, they can just walk right up to them and just start shooting them. Fischl, even though she is a physical Fischl, Oz will shoot enough to dismantle most shields except the Electro shield because he's Electro. Amber can use her burst. Actually, Amber's burst is one of the best crowd shield breaking tools in the entire game because it hits 18 times. It's that good. Ganyu is also squishier than normal, so she does need a shield of some sort to keep her from instantly dying. I did say this for Ganyu earlier, but if you skip that part, now you know. I already talked about resonance and artifacts for all of them, so I don't think I need to go over that either. If you want to hear me talk about what artifacts work best on them, you're going to have to go to their segments of the video because I'm not going to talk about it here. Their elemental reactions are good across the board for all of them. Tartaglia does have access to Vaporize, which can boost his damage a lot, but he has the same issue as Ganyu in that there is not a really good off-field power applicator. The best one currently is Shilling, and she mostly relies on her burst to do so, which is also not frequent enough to allow for a true total 2x damage multiplier for Tartaglia, because it spins around her, and it spins very slowly. Now, unfortunately for Tartaglia, it does, however, work for Ganyu's charge shots because each charge shot of Ganyu only takes up half of a power application, so both the initial arrow and resulting bloom both get the reverse melt bonus of 1.5 times damage. So, tough luck, Tartaglia. All in all, the best bow DPS character is Ganyu. She deals the highest damage out of all the others, regardless of formation, unless you're fighting a spread out cluster, in which case Tartaglia does do better, unless the cluster is even more spread out, in which case Ganyu does more damage. Maybe, because at that point, maybe her bloom can't reach it. There's a lot of factors that go into the spacing, because that goes into AI, enemy sizes, and overall, but Ganyu does deal the most damage, almost pretty much constantly, and even if she doesn't, she is competitive with Tartaglia. The only situation where Ganyu will deal less damage than the others is when she's fighting cryo enemies, or enemies that have the cryo type, like the Frost Arm Lava Churl. Technically not cryo, he does still take damage from cryo, but he has really high cryo resistance. Overall, though, the best bow character in the game is still Venti, because oh my god. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, or got something out of it, or learned something. If you liked it, please consider subscribing. It helps with the YouTube algorithm and makes me happy when I see that number go up. I'm not even going to ask you to hit that bell, but you totally should because my schedule just got more sporadic. If you didn't watch the beginning of this video, I am still in college, so that's why this video was so late. But that also means my next 4 or 5 videos might be delayed as well as classes start to ramp up. My next video is probably going to be about Xiao, I'm not sure. It really depends on how fast I can get the frame data on him. Or I might just do an optimized team build for him, I don't know, it really depends on my mood at the time. If anyone watching this has any ideas on what I should do, don't be afraid to suggest it in the comments. I do read every comment, but that's only because like 5 people comment on any of my videos. And yeah, that's pretty much it for channel updates. Thanks for watching.